Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special stream, which is kind of a reply to the excellent Semiogogue on a stream he did on the Pete Quinones Show a week or two ago about was America responsible for all of Europe's ills, which is obviously the case, not the case. I'd like to make it really clear that I like Semiogogue. He's one of my favorite YouTubers. I've appeared on his show and I would happily do so again. I also very often listen to Pete Quinones, so this is in no way to be construed as an attack on Semi or Pete Quinones. It's not, because many of the points that they brought up I actually do totally agree with. But there are some things which I don't think they got right. And Ataman, who is due to join me as my guest this evening, and I are going to address those this evening. Ataman, how are you going, mate?
Yeah, good, you?
Yeah, not at all bad. I was just introducing the stream to the audience and pointing out that this is in no way an attack against Semiogogue or Pete Quinones, who I like both of them. As I said, Semi's one of my favorite YouTubers. And I agreed with many of the points that they brought up on their stream. I just thought we would do a stream a bit more from the British perspective, or British and Old Commonwealth perspective, if you like, and just address a few things which I didn't think they got right.
I mean, I've told you before, I'm like a habitual watcher of the Pete Quinones Show anyway. I'm quite into both of them. I was hoping to maybe see Pete at the American event, but I didn't get a chance to go out there this year. Hopefully next. But
that would be cool. Like I said, I listen to Pete all the time. I watch just about all of Semi's streams. They're two very good guys, and like I said, I didn't basically disagree with a lot of the stuff they said at all. But I think one or two things they didn't get entirely correct, which is fine.
Yeah. I mean, I have a few small criticisms, but I think, to be honest as well, because this has been a conversation, right, that's been coalescing for a long time. They did that cigar stream a few, not Semi and Pete, but years. Pete, Paul Fahrenheit, and Furious,
yeah,
were on with AA talking about, is America the source of our woes? And it's like, on one hand, right, in the early days, AA could sometimes be a little anti-English, so it's kind of very cool to see him beating the drum. He released a very awesome edit in the early hours of this morning.
Yeah, I'm gonna play that at the end of the stream.
Yeah. So I kind of don't want to discourage him in a way, but at the same time, I kind of think that there's a lot that the Americans have gotten right about this conversation, and it's not perfidious Anglo, because that's not what most of them are saying, and it's not really what Semi and Pete were saying either. Like I remember Paul Fahrenheit, he got a little cringe in that cigar stream for a few reasons. He was saying stuff like, oh, well, if Europe wasn't interested in America ruling over it, they would have their own military and their own military defense. And it's like, well, a lot of people get this wrong, even here in Britain. But the truth of the matter is that if you look at what parties get elected, it's always actually pro-defense spending parties. It's always anti-immigration parties and pro-defense parties.
Well, apart from Labour.
Yeah. But you notice as well that, like, Labour only ever wins when the Tory vote collapses.
But I mean, the point I'm making is Labour have never been in favour of defence spending.
No,
but they're certainly also, in favour of immigration, but not defence spending.
Yeah, but they also struggle to actually. They also struggle, and the funny thing is, if you go and actually look at Labour manifestos, they practically never say. I double checked a bunch of them, including Corbyn's 2019 manifesto. And they never actually say they're going to cut defence spending. They do, right? Always, and it's kind of implicitly understood within their circles that they do, but they never actually campaign on it, and they never actually say they're going to. In fact, in the 2019 manifesto, you actually see Labour claiming that they're pro-defence. And they're they kind of do it in a funny way, though. They kind of imply that they're going to create more work in Britain through like defense contracts.
Yeah, they always come out with that crap and never do.
Yeah.
Alphabet Cat in the chat says, really, have you seen how many barracks, etc., have been closed by the current Tory party? Yeah, absolutely. I'm not defending the Conservatives. I'm not conservative. When I say conservatives, I use that word in air quotes because they don't conserve anything.
They closed down the army barracks here in Canterbury. It been there for a long time. It was enormous as well.
Yeah,
and they finally that had stayed there for many decades, and it was finally closed down, not under Blair but under the Tories.
Have they moved cross-channel migrants into it yet?
Yes, they have. They've built housing estates on it, which they've also put a lot of migrants into, and all sorts of other crap.
Absolutely correct. All right, let's get this a bit underway. One of the first things I wanted to bring up is that Semi was talking about the Dutch and the British starting this kind of world trade system. And first of all, the first people to start this system were actually the Spanish and the Portuguese, who were then followed by the Dutch and the English. But it was a mercantilist system. It wasn't a free trade system at all. It was a mercantilist system whereby you tried to bring your imports in from territories which you controlled in your empire, you basically had the mercantilist system was a closed system. It wasn't a world global trading system at all. And certainly up until the time of the American War of Independence, that's what the Brits were mostly doing.
Well, one of the interesting things about that as well is because you can read, I forget the essay by Thomas Carlyle, but he does an essay on the wheat laws and the whole campaign for protectionism around the wheat laws in the early 1800s.
The corn laws, yeah, absolutely,
the corn laws, it's kind of funny as well because it's like you could push the government for more protectionist policy, and they might not want to give it to you, but they would eventually give it to you if you pushed hard enough. Whereas, under the current system, they would sooner send half their population to gulags than give on either immigration or globalist. Current modern. So one of the things that I drew from on some of my notes was there's this Substack article by this guy Fisted by Foucault, who's a very good Substack writer, despite the name. He's also quite a bizarre individual generally, but and he has this article called Turbo America, and he kind of lays down how America sort of exports its subversion all over, which we'll probably get into a bit more later. But one of the things that one of the things with that is that even at Britain's height, Britain was probably significant in relative terms. Britain was probably significantly more powerful than America is even now. In relative terms,
mid 19th century, I wouldn't disagree with that. In the mid 19th century,
and yet you never really saw a turbo Britain in quite the same way.
No.
In fact, funny enough, people like to slag off British food, right? For example, but the fact that American food, despite the fact that most of the world thinks it's crap, the pervasiveness of American food versus the lack of pervasiveness of British or indeed European food more generally.
Yeah, where do you go in Britain without Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's and all this stuff?
You can go to like the farthest reaches of the world and get Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's, but you can't necessarily go there and get a Yorkshire pudding or pork pies or stuff like that. And it's like and it's like that's kind of more symbolic of the fact that Britain didn't. I mean, this is food. It's a minor thing in broader cultural terms, but it is kind of more indicative of the fact that Britain didn't completely ram its culture down the throats of other people. And it's like maybe that was also a lack of means because of the massive differences in technological, but it also seems to be largely a lack of interest as well.
Well, look, I mean, I think British food is overly criticised. I think well-cooked British food is very good. And there's classics like bacon and eggs, roast beef, fish and chips, etc., which are all, if they're well-cooked, they're all really good. but you'll only find those dishes in countries which are very culturally closely associated with Britain, like in Australia. I can go and get that stuff very easily. I'm sure that's probably true in Canada and New Zealand, and it certainly used to be true in South Africa, for example. But it's not so much in other places by any means.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, to an extent, the American foods we're talking about, I'm sure Semi and Pete would say they're not American foods, and I actually think that would also be fair. You know, because
look, I'm sure there are plenty of good home-cooked American foods for sure.
Yeah, like most Americans, especially like base Dixies and stuff like that, would say, "Well, hang on a minute, you know, McDonald's is not real Americana food or whatever. It's corporate American food, right? It's America as an empire." But like there was a guy that someone made me aware of a month or so ago. I forget his name. He was assassinated in, I think, the early 1920s in India. And he was a British civil servant who was trying to like bring an end to the caste system, right? And it's like that would be an example of like what they're getting at with like Britain being just as bad as America in trying to export. But that's in the 1920s. That's very late in the
very
game.
Very late in the British Empire. I would say, and I've argued this before, Adam, as I think you know, that Britain's last chance to make something decent of the old white Commonwealth parts of the empire was in the very early 20th century, and it failed because of tariff reform failing.
Yeah.
You know, without tariff reform, you couldn't do it. Like Britain, this goes back to the thing we were talking about at the beginning, like the mercantile system. The mercantile system was abandoned really after the American War of Independence, largely, as a result of the thinking and writing of people like Adam Smith, etc. That's when Britain adopted this free trade policy, which was, to be fair, because Britain had such a lead in terms of the Industrial Revolution, for probably about 50 to 60 years, it was a good thing for Britain to be in favour of that from the point of view of Britain making money and increasing wages for workers and all that kind of stuff. After about 1860, that became increasingly less true as other countries caught up. And at that stage, Britain, I think, should have adopted some sort of tariff policy, as indeed all of the big nations like Germany, France, America, etc., had already done and always had.
Yeah, definitely. And it's like, well, there was another point as well, which kind of goes off of the mercantilist system. It's that Semiogogue brought up about the British Empire moving Bantus into South Africa.
Yes, I do want to go on to this, yes.
Yeah, because I don't know anything about this. And I did try to do a bit of research and I wasn't really... Like, I know that like the South Africans had this... The lefties accused the South African whites of having this empty land myth. I don't think that's strictly what the South Africans claim or claimed. No. They claim more that it was a bunch of different tribes that are still present but are much smaller than they used to be.
Well, not all of them. Like the Hottentots were actually wiped out by the Bantu. But you still have the San, which is to say the Bushmen. But they only live in the very most remote areas. Like Bushmen used to live in the Drakensberg Mountains in Natal. And you can still see their art in cave paintings and this kind of stuff. But the Zulus wiped them out.
Yeah.
You know, they basically took the women as slaves, which is why Zulu today has lots of tongue clicks in it. So like the Zulu king in the time of the Anglo-Zulu War was a bloke called Hwayo. And that tongue click, Hwayo, that is a Bushman thing, which was adopted because they took all these women as slaves. But originally, Zulu didn't have those tongue clicks.
Yeah. Well, there's another group as well that does a lot of the clicks. I don't know how to pronounce them. Is it the Kwasa?
Yeah.
What did they come down with the Bantu migration, or were they also already there?
I think those guys were a bit more of a mixed race.
Right.
But one of the things I wanted to get across is that where Semi made a mistake is, like, for example, the coloured people in South Africa, the mixed race coloured people, who, by the way, almost all speak Afrikaans as their language at home.
Yeah, I do think it's worth pointing out that because obviously, like here in Europe, people will use the term coloured to describe someone who's non-white, whereas in South Africa, it's specifically someone who's mixed race, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Right,
It's
okay.
somewhat, well, but they're actually almost their own race now because they've been going for so long.
Yeah.
Those guys, Semiogogue said the Brits moved them there, and that's just not true. That was the Dutch East India Company, which of course used to run the Cape. The Dutch East India Company moved those people mainly from the Dutch East Indies, which of course today is Indonesia.
Right.
The Brits had nothing whatever to do with creating the coloured people in South Africa. Nothing.
Right.
Britain only took over the Cape during the Napoleonic Wars. We then gave it back, and then Holland sold it to Britain after the Napoleonic Wars.
See, I thought I saw as well that South Africa was closer to 50% white sometime in the 1800s, but I haven't been able to find that again, so I'm not sure if I was mistaken.
It might be to some degree true, because of course the infant death rates would have been enormous back then, especially amongst tribal people. And there were far more white people then. I mean, there were more white people in South Africa when I moved there in 1985 than there are today, because loads of people did what was called the chicken run. And you could even say I did to some degree when I left in 2000, although that was years after the black government had taken over. And the country had gone downhill even by 2000. It's got much worse since then. And if you want to go and see what's happening in South Africa today, I can't do better than recommend Conscious Caracol's channel on YouTube. He's a really good dude. Excellent bloke. He and I wouldn't totally agree on late 19th century South African history, but he's a good bloke who's doing his best to fight for his own people, the Afrikaners. But no, the mixed race coloured people in South Africa had nothing whatever to do with the British. It was that was a group that was already there when the British took over the Cape. What Britain did do in the 19th century was, and not the British government, private companies for the most part, many of whom were operating in South Africa, they did import Indians into Natal. Like even today, Durban is, I think, the biggest Indian city outside of the subcontinent. But they were employed to cut sugarcane because the Zulus wouldn't do it. The Zulu blokes wanted to be warriors, cops, night watchmen, any job like that. They were not interested in doing labouring jobs at all. And even today, when the Zulus do sometimes cut cane, it's mostly women, not blokes.
Well, Bantus aren't really interested in labour jobs either, to be fair.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I'm not arguing with that. But I mean, the Zulus in particular have this thing that blokes have to do something vaguely military, if you get what I mean. But yeah, I mean, in their traditional society, the blokes basically looked after the cows and stuff and had beer drinks and all the rest of it. And 99% of the work was done by the chicks.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, the British did move Indians. Well, not the British government, but the British Empire, I suppose you could say vaguely, did move Indians into Natal, but not in vast numbers. Not at all in vast numbers.
They built an administrative class, didn't they? Kind of like same in West Africa. Like
not so much, Ataman. Not so much. Like I said, they originally were moved to Natal to cut sugarcane. Because bear in mind there was no machines to do it back then, but they didn't move like millions of them. It was thousands, not millions.
Yeah.
Britain also moved some Indians to a few places on Pacific Islands, usually again for the same thing, to cut sugarcane or do some sort of labouring work like that. But you're not talking about vast numbers of people at all.
Well, this is the thing as well, because there's a difference in like approach. So it's like, is our Indians being moved into West Africa like for or other parts of Africa generally, like Sunak's family, right? To be like petty admin, to kind of separate the sort of ruling British class from the sort of the mere administration work. Is that as bad as America trying to black and brown up the white world today, the American empire specifically?
The numbers we're talking about are vastly smaller in the British case.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course it's like vast differences in intent, but of course to an extent, you know,
and of course we weren't moving those people into Britain or Europe. None of these people were moved into Britain or Europe. I mean, unless you count something like 1,000 slaves who probably joined the Royal Navy in about 100 years. So, you know, you're talking about 100 a decade, which is nothing. None of these people actually moved to Europe.
Yeah, and it's like to segue from that one as well. I mean, one of the things that Pete claims, which kind of got my antennas up, was he said there was never really a push for mass migration from the US into Europe. He kind of argues that that European governments kind of did that on their own. I think I'm characterizing his statement right with that. But you know, from this Substack with Fisted by Foucault, right, called Turbo America, and there's another one as well called the Disquamation of America. You know, he highlights a tweet, and it's someone quoting Joe Biden, and it says, "There's no longer a bright line between foreign and domestic policy, and to push back against authoritarianism effectively, the US must make racial equity a whole of government effort." And this kind of goes in.
Sorry, when was that written?
That was 2021. Right. So obviously, like when Biden came in, he signed all these executive orders, right? And one of them was 14,075, or however they number it there, which basically you see Secretary Blinken, right, of the State Department, requiring that all agencies which are tied into embassies all over the world to work with other agencies of the federal government to report on what they call like human rights abuses, right? So most of this is focused on the alphabet people. I think that particular executive order is about the alphabet people. And by human rights abuses, they're talking about like conversion therapy that may like stop kids from wanting to be trans, for example. That was a big target. They were talking about that very specifically.
You can't possibly protect children, of course.
No, and it's like, okay, yeah, that's very recent, and I think Pete does say, except maybe recently, but you know, a lot of this works on an earlier precedent off of a previous framework. You know, you can go and look at, like, obviously we've got very limited information to work on, but there was a WikiLeaks document from the 6th of June 2006 where the US embassy was communicating with US federal agencies, talking about the importance of diversifying Estonia. And their recommendations including like implementing hate crime legislation. They're complaining that there's no dedicated hate legislation to protect like non-white people in Estonia, and they also complain that that the punishments for hate crimes that do exist are way too lax.
And of course, hate crimes are a made-up thing. There's no such thing as a hate crime, really. Something's a crime or it's not, basically.
Yeah, it's funny as well that all these institutions all claim to be for rehabilitative justice, except when it comes to hate crimes, when suddenly they're like screaming to throw away the key and like give people the electric chair and shit. They wanted to train law enforcement, but the worst one of all is they were basically expecting the Estonian government, I don't know if they ever did this or not, they might well have, to implement school programs to teach children the benefits of diversity.
Well, look, we know that they do this. They're even doing it in Ukraine as we speak. You know, Ukraine is becoming more and more waving the rainbow flag around, and you know, gay fags all over the place and all the rest of it. Absolutely, America pushes that today. I don't think that either Semi or Pete would deny that fact that they push it today. I think their conversation and what I'm a bit more interested in is what was going on in the 19th century and the late 18th century. But yeah, absolutely, they push it today 100%, and they do push it on other nations for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, this was from 2006, and this isn't like the earliest, right? This is the funny thing is you can go and read it as well. It's quite easy to find. People can just Google like WikiLeaks Estonia 2006. Let's say will probably give you it pretty easily. They talk about this very nonchalantly. At this point, it's very much established. There was actually a whole program that they ran through the early 2000s into the mid 2000s. I forget what it was called. Was it called like Minority Outreach Program or something like that? They basically took like, black and brown, like what Morgoth calls the skintellectuals, right?
Yep.
And they put them through these like US State Department training camps to basically be like race grifters in Europe.
Well, I mean, America in Afghanistan was like putting great big murals of George Floyd up and flying the rainbow flag from various American government and military places and all the rest of it. And the Brits were no better. I'm not trying to say we are, because Britain just copies America in everything for most part.
This is the thing. A lot of this pressure does come from America. I mean, I'm talking about stuff that only happened 20 years ago, whereas we're kind of talking about an empire that's gone on for about 100 years. But the kind of the issue is that even if you go back to these 26 documents or even a few a little bit earlier, the confidence, the language that they use, the confidence that they have in these processes, there's already an entire, by 2006, an entire vocabulary set up for this stuff. There's already programs set in place. This is something that at that point had already been running for a long time.
Yep.
And it just so happens that, and this is something that AA I think did get right. It just so happens that like right after the civil rights movement, all of these laws basically get parachuted into all these European countries, like out of nowhere.
After the 1960s, yes, absolutely correct.
Like Race Relations Act here and so on and so forth.
There was no American pressure behind that, of course not. No.
And it like Pete and Semi do. I mean, Semiogogue does point out that like, if you want to look at like specifically the gay stuff, other countries have like almost done their best to outwoke America on that.
Oh, look, mate, when I was a British soldier in the early 1980s, I remember us as British soldiers taking the piss out of the Dutch because they allowed gays in their military, and the guys didn't get their hair cut. They were allowed to wear hairnets under their helmets. And we all just thought that was hilarious back then.
Yeah.
That's how alien it was to British culture back then, British military culture back then.
Yeah.
Lavish in the chat is saying an Indian was telling her that the British brought Indians over as slaves to the UK. Lavish, that is utter bullshit. Slavery within Britain itself was basically illegal from at latest about the 1780s by a High Court legal decision. You couldn't be a slave in England. In fact, I believe the High Court judgment said the air of Britain was too free for a slave to be able to breathe it. And so you basically could not be a slave in Britain itself from the 1780s. And of course, Britain outlawed the slave trade in the early 1800s, and in 33 or 34, I think it was, slavery was outlawed in the whole British Empire. So any Indian telling you that is just talking bullshit.
Well, yeah, sure, but it's like, I mean, even anything approaching chattel slavery was basically banned under William the Conqueror anyway.
In Britain itself, yes.
But we might, to be honest, at this point, I just think, what was the point in the high road? We might as well have just had all those slaves and just carried on as normal. Like, you're going to get accused of it anyway when you're a nation in decline. So this is, of course, another problem I have with the anti-British stuff. I'll hear like right-wing friends of mine, or supposedly right-wing friends of mine, and they'll say like, they wish that we'd never had the empire. They wish that we'd never had this stuff because then we wouldn't have to hear all this crap. And it's like, dude, they have to hear about this stuff in Sweden. They have to hear about this stuff in fucking Ireland, right? Like they're gonna.
And those countries didn't have empires.
Yeah, they're gonna blame you for this stuff anyway. You kind of just have to. You kind of just have to grow thicker skin and take it on the chin and go, yeah, but it was better when we were around. So fucking suck it.
It's like Australia. Australia was formed initially in 1788 by the First Fleet. Before that, it was just a wilderness and a patchwork of Stone Age tribes, basically, who didn't build anything because they couldn't. And slavery was always illegal in Australia. Slavery's never been legal in Australia, ever. Not since it was first formed as a colony in New South Wales.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, and it's like, yeah, another point that came up in the stream. I'm not sure if we want to keep going on the slavery stuff or not. And this one might be a bit contentious for you because I know you're not the biggest fan of Francis Parker Yockey. But in his essay "Enemy of Europe," he there's a bit where he points out, it's quite early on actually, that in 1936. Britain basically kind of got cucked a little bit on its sovereignty over its navy because the Second London Naval Treaty kind of required that you had to consult with Washington before you could deploy any major fleet anywhere.
That's not true, man. I'm sorry.
Well, see, hang on, see. So I dug into this a bit more, and it's like, because I was thinking that's not how it's worded, right?
Yeah,
the Second Naval Treaty, but
yeah, and it wasn't practical that either, because the British Royal Navy was still the largest navy in the world up until 1942.
But you can look up api.parliament.uk, and you can look up a talk from some minutes from a meeting on the 4th of May 1936, and it features Viscount Lady Astor.
Yeah, who was a prat and a bitch. But she's the woman who the song D-Day Dodgers in Italy was written about. She was an absolute prat, and she was also American, by the way.
Yeah, well, she was one of the few people pushing back against this. So, Churchill, Lord Stanley, and Earl Alexander of Hillsborough, who I looked into, he was like a Labour guy, but at this point he was First Lord of the Admiralty.
Yeah,
and that's how he describes it. He literally describes it as something where we'll be expected to consult America. That's literally how he words it to
yeah,
Churchill,
but it wasn't. It wasn't a real thing, Armin. I'm sorry.
But that's how they saw it. Like we can argue over what the actual wording of something is, but legislation ultimately comes down to how it's implied or how it's considered at the time.
Yeah, but it really, I mean, honestly, mate, it really wasn't the case.
You can go and read the minutes yourself. That this
I'm not
and they accept it as such.
I'm not suggesting that you're not telling the truth in terms of the minutes. I wouldn't suggest that for a moment. I'm just saying that in actual fact, that's not what it was meant. That was not what was meant by that.
Well, that was you can read it for yourself. That's like however the treaty itself is worded, that was how it was understood by the people making the decision.
Well, I will actually go and look at this because, as you know, I like naval history, and I will also consult a couple of naval historians I know to see what they say about this. But I am virtually certain that that's not actually what was meant by that at all. But anyway. I think it's a bit of a distraction from what we're talking about anyway.
Well, I don't think it is, because I think
I see what you're saying. You're saying, look, I am the first to say that the original Washington Naval Treaty in 1922, the British should not have joined. It was a huge mistake for Britain to join that.
And both the First and Second London Naval Treaty were just a continuation of that.
Yeah, they were a continuation of the Washington Treaty. So, yeah, in a way, I agree with you, because I don't think Britain should have ever joined that Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. I think Britain should have built the 4 huge N3s and the 4 huge G3 battleships and battlecruisers, and then said to the American Congress, well, if you're going to pay for ships like that, go for it, boys. Because Britain could afford it after World War I, despite what some people think today.
Well, the other interesting thing actually from those minutes is they point out that it actually cost them more money to follow the Second Naval Treaty than it did if they had to go without, because they had to scrap tons of already working ships.
Oh yeah, they did. Yeah, Britain scrapped more ships than anybody else, quite a long way. I mean, that was how Britain and America ended up with the same number of battleships. It's because Britain scrapped far more ships than the Americans did, because the Royal Navy was much bigger than the American Navy in 1919.
Yeah, because in those minutes, Churchill is specifically actually asking for money, like obscene amounts of money, to replace like large, powerful ships with ones that actually comply with the tonnage requirements.
Yeah, well, which would have been smaller, of course, but yeah, I see what you're saying. But yeah, I think the whole Washington Naval Treaty thing was a huge mistake on Britain's part, but it was brought about by World War One, and of course, joining World War One in 1914, and then raising a vast army against all British military tradition was like one of the original sins of the British Empire. But I've said this for years, so you know.
Well, maybe here's another segue point, because one of the points that comes up, this isn't said by Pete and Semi, but one of the points that comes up in this conversation generally is this idea that I think is a myth, but I'm not entirely sure, that Britain basically coerced or sort of dragged America into World War One.
Yeah, I don't think that's particularly true. I mean, America was more friendly with France in many respects than it was Britain for a start. I know Americans like to say Britain conned them into World War One. I'm not quite sure how they did. And like America only joined the war in 1917, so like 1 year before it finished.
Yeah.
And very few American troops actually fought in World War One, which is why their losses are so very, very small, relatively speaking, in World War One compared to like Britain and France and Germany and everybody else, because they only fought really for the last, 6-7 months maybe. And many of the American troops, even those who arrived in Europe, many of them didn't fight. They saw no action.
Yeah.
But, you know, this idea that somehow Britain conned the Americans into joining World War One is just nonsense as far as I'm concerned. America did extremely well out of World War One.
Well, this is kind of the thing, isn't it? Because it's like Woodrow Wilson goes into World War One. Like the implication is that like Woodrow Wilson had the wall pulled over his eyes, but he went into World War One with a kind of a particularist idea of how he wanted Europe to look for American interests.
Yes,
and at the end of World War One, Europe does look that way. So I'm not going to sit here and say like, oh, you know, actually it was America that, like, I kind of think there's a bit more of that argument for World War II, but even then not completely. But you know, at the end of the day, all you could really accuse America of is maybe being a little bit of an enabler, and I don't really think that excuse holds water. Like, our own elites and hierarchy fucked up majorly by taking us into that war.
Oh yeah, 100%. Adam and you and I have spoken about this, I don't know, 2-3 years ago at least.
Yeah.
You know, Britain joining World War One in 1914 was one of the original sins of Britain and the Empire. It absolutely was. There was no reason for Britain to join it.
Yeah.
All Britain needed to do was declare an armed neutrality and say, if the High Seas Fleet comes out, then the Royal Navy will sink it. But other than that, we don't care.
Yeah, and I mean, on the World War II end, obviously there were a few other things that played into this. Like, there were certain American and other industrialists that kept people like Churchill propped up because Churchill was pro the war. You know, Huey Long, Huey Long, the massively anti-war candidate in America, was assassinated by a Jewish journalist. Which we don't necessarily have to go into it. That's like a whole different discussion.
That's hard to believe. That's hard to believe. But
yeah. But not to say that I'm saying the Jews are off the table in this discussion. They're not. But just the Huey Long situation. I don't know enough about it. I only know the basics. And of course, you know, the like, it is kind of funny how the same crap popping up here at the time, which is like elites who appear self-destructive are the same ones there. Bap does this bit where he says that the Jews in Britain were not as pervasive in the power structure as they were in America, and this is something that I think
that's true.
Yeah, I don't think Pete and Semi think it's true. I do also think it's true. It definitely came about towards the end.
Listen, let me just say, I don't think Semi does, but Pete possibly does a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to put arguments to them that aren't fair. So people should probably still go and listen to their stream and get their side of it. It's a good.
Listen, the link to their stream is in the description, guys. I would like you to go and watch it. Do subscribe to Semi and Pete's channels. They're both excellent, and Ataman and I both watch most of the stuff they do. So absolutely, as I said, this is not a stream that's anti those guys at all. It's just putting a British and old Commonwealth perspective on what they were talking about.
Well, I mean, like, for example, right, so like Kanye West, right? Kanye West has his JP Morgan and I think it was JP Morgan bank account closed, or Morgan and Chase, I should say, bank account closed. And for being anti-Semitic, right? Which is something they wouldn't even do to their boy Epstein, right? However, in Britain, you can, during the Empire days, you can find evidence of like Jews working to some extent within the British elite structure. And it's like, how do you know this? It's like, well, because like prominent writers and generals were talking quite openly about it. There's a line. I mean, you said, you said you brought up that someone had mentioned Niall Ferguson in your research.
Yes.
And you were saying he's quite a liberal historian, which he absolutely is.
Yeah, very much so.
I think he's maybe just a touch more base than he probably lets on.
I used to think that, but then I've read some of his more recent stuff, and my opinion of him has gone down a bit. But yeah, all right.
Right, I haven't read any of his recent stuff. I've only read.
Can I just say to you, Adam, and Peter Waker in the chat is saying the assassin of Huey Long was a German-American Catholic called Carl Weiss.
Oh, I could have sworn he was Jewish. Oh, never mind then. But yeah, still, he was an anti-war guy, and he was assassinated. And yeah, I did know about that. Yeah, him and Niall Ferguson didn't support Brexit. And who was the other guy? The guy that wrote Das Reich and a lot of those pop history World War II books. Max Hastings. He also got like Brexit derangement syndrome.
Yeah, Max Hastings back in the 80s was fairly based, but he just totally lost it later on. Yeah. And became a huge shill for Britain joining World War I and all sorts of other crap.
Yeah, but like one of the things that Niall Ferguson argues, like he brings up like a little phrase that was like common, or that was spoken by a few prominent figures, and was quite well known. Was during the golden age of antiquity. Helen's was the face that could launch 1,000 ships, you know, in that famous line. But it then goes on to say, in our glorious age, or in our golden age, the face wears the weathered features of a Hebrew banker or something like that. So it was kind of they definitely existed within the elite structure. There was definitely, like, you know, I mean, in that stream they particularly bring up like JP Morgan himself and figures like that. But it also seems like they couldn't, you know, to go back to the phrase Turbo America, it almost seems like that, like there were certain inroads that were still shut to them. You know, like you had figures like Toynbee, like who was quite anti-Semitic in some of his writings. You know, even up into like just after in like the post-war period and stuff like that. So it was a different relationship. I'm not entirely sure how to characterize it, but it was definitely a different relationship to how Zionism and the Jews and that play out in America today. It's something's changed, and I'm not sure if I'm going to sit there and go, oh, it's the implicit liberalism of America and the idea of it being this nation for everyone. I don't even believe that, but something has changed.
Look, there's a couple of things. First of all, I think something I wanted to do at the beginning and I haven't done, a bit like Semi did on history, is that when you're talking about the Americans or the British, obviously what we're talking about is the ruling people and the governments. We are not talking about the actual people of those countries at all. You know, there are many, even today, there are many very good based Americans, just as there are many good based Brits and Australians and all the rest of it, but they are not running their governments anymore. So I think that needs to be made clear. Also, people have been talking in the chat about why America joined the war, the First World War, and it was the unrestricted U-boat campaign. And Germany knew that this would bring America into the war, but they thought it was worth doing it because they thought they could defeat the British and French before the Americans could send over enough troops to make any difference. Also, I've often seen it said that the Brits gave the Americans the intelligence that Germany had offered to give Mexico back California and Texas and all the rest of it if Mexico attacked America. And yes, British intelligence did do that, but it wasn't a lie. The Germans did actually tell the Mexicans that. So it wasn't that the British were lying, they just pointed it out to the Americans,
Yeah.
Which, I mean, look, I think it was a stupid both telling Mexico that they would let them take back all the stuff they lost in the Spanish-American War in the 1840s. I think that was a mistake by Germany, but also the unrestricted U-boat campaign was a mistake by Germany,
Yeah. There is a point when I was reading about the Second London Naval Treaty as well, funnily enough, a bit offhand for the topic, but there is a point in there where something I was reading on it, someone at the time or shortly after was saying, like, does the Admiralty, this might have actually been Churchill, I don't know. Someone was like, does the Admiralty understand the extent of the danger they've brought on themselves with the changes to like submarine warfare that they were bringing about under this treaty, which I thought was quite interesting. Maybe something to look into later. I don't really know enough about the subject, but
yeah, I think Britain took anti-submarine warfare. The British Navy took anti-submarine warfare very seriously after World War One, and Britain was actually quite well prepared for it in World War Two. And the Germans came far closer to bringing Britain to the edge of starvation in World War One with their U-boat campaign than they ever did in World War Two.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I remember when I was in school, my teacher was like, the Navy, they couldn't take out submarines. They were completely, they were like British vessels were just completely vulnerable to them. No, exactly. Like later on, I remember going to Chatham dockyards and speaking with like one of the guides and like history guys there, and he was running through like all of the measures that they had to wipe out submarines, and he described the the idea of being on a submarine in World War II as being an absolutely horrifying experience.
Absolutely.
For, like,
go watch Das Boot, which is like a good. It shows you like how it wasn't fun to be on a German submarine in World War II. The Brits had things like ASDIC, which of course these days we call by the American name sonar. But I mean, it was the Brits who invented that stuff. So a destroyer or anti-submarine frigate or sloop or whatever could actually detect a submarine under the water.
Yeah, and it's like I don't know if you watched that film. I thought there was certain aspects of that film that really ruined it, but that film Greyhound.
Oh God, that was terrible.
Yeah, I really wanted to like
that. That was an American World War II destroyer which only saw action in the Pacific because they were the best American destroyers. You would have never got one of those escorting a convoy. Just no chance whatsoever.
No. I wanted to love it because it's such a cool setting. It's something that hasn't been done enough in modern films. But
the best film about that easily is the British movie The Cruel Sea from 1953. That's so old
now, though.
Yeah, but it's such a good movie even today. It stands up still today. It's
such a shame that with our amazing special effects and everything now, we also just can't actually make the films that we used to.
Well, no lefty British film director is going to make a film which shows the Brits in a good light.
Well, that's the thing, though, isn't it? Like the guys that wrote Zulu were lefties. I mean that's.
But I mean that was in the 60s, mate, when lefties were not as lefty as they are now.
Yeah, but even in the 60s, lefties were pretty degenerate. I mean, they must have they probably would have been tankies if they were around.
But not compared to today, mate. Not compared to today. They just weren't. I mean, like the dude who directed Zulu was an American dude who was chucked out from America during the McCarthy stuff.
Yeah.
And as we all know today, McCarthy was actually much more accurate than was pretended in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
Yes. Yeah.
But but he, and the dude who wrote the idea for it is a guy called John Preble, who was a communist, a Scottish guy who was a communist at one stage.
Yeah, but I do think a lot of those guys would have been like closer to tankies if they were still around now.
Oh yeah, look, and they weren't anti white people, basically, or Anglo-Celtic in the British case, but they weren't anti-white people.
Yeah.
But if you like Das Boot, about the German U-boat in World War II, and that's a great movie, by the way. I really do like it. I think originally it was a mini-series, actually. And I watched that too. But if you like that, if you want to see the British side of things, you've got to go and watch The Cruel Sea from 1953. It's a good film, and it still stands up today. But yeah, absolutely right.
They're talking about McCarthy in the chat. Alphabet Cat said McCarthy was based. He had a point about communism's influence on the USA.
Yes, he did.
Cardamon said, AA said McCarthy has fallen for a psyop. Yeah, I think that was true. You definitely. I read a book. I read a couple actually. There was one called. God, I can't even see it on my shelf now. Blacklisted by History. I think that was it. But there's also a few others, and it's like that. That's definitely true in that while he was pursuing communists, he was looking for this link to Moscow, which he found. But then he also started uncovering links back to Washington, and that was kind of the point where it seems he was. And we could never really get evidence on that being the case, but now we seem to have it. So,
Davey 1602 in the chat have yet to watch Dunkirk. Any recommendations? If you're talking about the Christopher Nolan Dunkirk, it's crap. I wouldn't bother.
I liked it.
Well, all right. I thought it was crap. Like the only
it has some major issues, but
the only naval ship in it is way too modern to be a World War II ship, and it plainly is. Just look at it. I think it's a Dutch ship or something. The Navy plays almost no part in it, which in fact it was the Navy who evacuated the British Army. The little boats were used to take the guys from the beaches to the destroyers and all the other bigger ships.
Yeah.
But it was crap. Honestly, it was not a good film. It was not an accurate film. I see Mitch in the chat. If you liked it, great, but it wasn't accurate at all. There were nowhere near enough troops.
Yeah, but that's because he has a particular filming style and he doesn't want to use
he won't use CGI, I know.
He likes his practical stuff.
But I would just say, if the original Dunkirk movie made in 59, I think.
Yeah, Ministry Curious said it in chat. 58, yeah, much better.
Yeah, that's actually a good film with John Mills. That's actually a good movie and much more historically accurate than Nolan's film is.
Yeah, that is a better film. But I didn't dislike Nolan's new one. I mean, I didn't pay to go see it. If I did, I might be maybe a touch disappointed. But partly because I'm stingy, but yeah, if you can watch it on TV for free or something, it's a perfectly fine evening watch. There's just it's got some good cinematography. It's got some.
There's too much about the RAF and nowhere near enough about the Royal Navy in it. But all right. But yeah, I didn't like it very much, I have to say. But that 1958-59 one is actually a good movie. It's much more accurate. The scenes on the beach and all the rest of it. And that is not CGI. They just got a load of extras. But anyway, I feel like we're wandering a bit here.
Yeah.
Which is bound to happen, of course. I also, before we stop talking about did the British Empire move populations around, I wanted to talk about white populations. And like Australians, for example, and I noticed, I think Semi or somebody talked about people being sent to Australia by Britain. Relatively small numbers of convicts were sent to Australia by Britain. The vast majority of Australian people, like overwhelmingly the vast majority, are the descendants of free settlers who came to Australia because there were assorted gold rushes here and all the rest of it.
Yeah, if you're not British in the chat or listening in generally, and you hear Brits always going, "Oh yeah, you bunch of convicts," it's just banter. It's just Anglo banter.
It's a laugh. They call us POMs and all the rest of it, and we'll call them convicts, and it's a family joke in a way. But the vast majority of Australian settlers were free settlers who came to Australia, and of course Australia had something like 5 or maybe even 6 gold rushes during the 19th century. If you were lucky, you could come to Australia and become extremely rich. So loads of people came here, surprise, surprise. And it's much the same thing with Canada and New Zealand and even South Africa. Large numbers of Brits did leave Britain in the 19th century, and they went to Australia or Canada or New Zealand or South Africa sometimes. But the British government did almost nothing to encourage that. Almost nothing. And of course, loads of Brits also went to America, by the way. If you look at American immigration stuff, and particularly before they did that anti-immigration bill in the 1920s, they looked at how many people were descended from various places, including Britain. Britain was one of the highest in the 19th century. Loads of Brits moved to America in the 19th century. But the British government did next to nothing to encourage any of that.
Yeah. I've seen because one of the things that comes up a lot is that you'll see these graphs where they'll show or these charts where they'll show states of America, and it will show an enormous amount of them being predominantly people of German ancestry.
Yep.
But those aren't based on actual DNA tests. Those are based on asking people what their ethnicity and their ancestry is. And people just say German because English is kind of considered unpopular there. But except I think is it Idaho where the Mormons are from, where it's all English, or all British, I should say. But yeah, if you go by actual genealogy, America is large outside of a few coastal areas. The white population is largely all Anglo.
Yeah. I mean, look, another thing, because I'm into military history, there's a website, and I can't remember what it's called now, but there's a website where you could look at the antecedents of all of the dudes who were killed with the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn. And there's quite a lot of British guys in there. There's Irish guys as well, of course, who were also British back then.
Yeah.
But there's also quite a lot of English, Scottish, Welsh guys who served in the 7th Cavalry because they moved to America.
Yeah.
But the idea that the British government encouraged that is just nonsense, because the British government did almost nothing to encourage immigration. It was the only people who did were private dudes. There would be private companies set up saying, okay, we'll give you a relatively cheap passage to Australia or Canada or New Zealand or wherever it might be. But it had nothing to do with the government.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, even when you look at the £10 POM scheme, the Australian
that was an Australian thing. It wasn't the British government.
The British government funny enough, didn't do anything to discourage it either. They just let it be.
No, they didn't. And at the same time, also, there were guys and girls from British children's homes, for example, who were allowed to immigrate to Australia in the 40s and 50s. But again, it wasn't really a British government thing. There was no, it's just people decided they would do that. And it was the Aussies who were pushing for it because, of course, back then the Australians had the sensible White Australia policy.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's the other thing that's kind of irritating about this whole immigration thing is that that one of the excuses they have is that it's to do with low birth rates. Even in that WikiLeaks document about Estonia, they say, they will experience non-white migrant pressure due to low birth rates. And it's funny enough, I always have this thing where I say that you should probably take birth rates have to be considered as a ratio of whatever infant mortality is at the time, right? Yeah. Because parents are kind of looking at how many kids they have. sort of, reaching adolescence. And the thing is, if you look at it like that, you suddenly realize that, let's say in the 1920s or also the 1870s, birth rates were also very low, like below replacement rate for a few decades. In the 1870s and for less in the 1920s. And the governments at the time were just like, yeah, no, it'll go back up with time. Just leave it be. Don't do anything about it. Don't worry about it. Maybe put out an advert promoting, having kids, but beyond that, don't care otherwise.
I mean, it's especially like today when we've got the ever increasing automation and everyone is talking about AI.
Yeah, so they claim anyway.
Yeah, I think AI is a bit overblown, but everyone goes on about that stuff, and obviously things are getting more automated. You walk into your supermarket these days, and you probably do your own checkout and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. But the point I'm making is, in that situation, why on earth do we have to have more and more people? Because all more and more people does, in the sense of mass immigration, is it pushes down wages, especially for the lower skilled, whilst at the same time pushing up housing costs, inevitably. I mean, Japan is in a much better position than Britain, and yet Japan is well over 98.5% still Japanese.
Yeah, and of course it's cope anyway because of the democratic system. None of the governments who say we need immigration because of a coming population collapse will be in power when it happens anyway, and thus don't care. And secondly, they were laying down the foundations for a lot of this stuff before this was a problem. Like at the time when the Nationalities Act came in, right? Which let's also just point out, the 1948 Nationalities Act was a law that was specifically trying to bring Britain's standard for citizenship away from an old monarchic system of subjects and more to an American Republican style system. And now we've got this weird sort of in the middle system.
Where we have a prime minister no one elected, not even the members of the so-called Conservative Party.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And, and it's like, if you look at, and of course, when that came in, birth rates were actually still quite high and increasing. And it's like, am I blaming all modern immigration on America? Yes, but also partly no, because if you go back and look at like the 1919 race riots, American Krogan on his Substack does a good article basically debunking a lot of the crap that's said about the 1919 race riots and going into it in detail generally. And it's like, you could probably say that was a proto example of immigration that we experience now in a very tiny form, and that wasn't connected to America, not as far as I can tell anyway, or as far as I could probably assume either.
I don't disagree. I mean, look, I'm going to give another example here. Like, America absolutely took over Japan after World War II, but Japan is still 98.5% Japanese.
Yeah.
And like Lothar Sheffield saying Japanese toilets are unnecessarily complicated. Okay, but at least they have them, unlike India, which and India has a space program. They just landed a spacecraft on the moon. They have nuclear weapons. The Indians build their own aircraft carriers. And yet Britain is still giving them $57 million a year, which is like $70 million. Why?
It's funny as well, because it's like the amount of Indians who they take pride in Sunak being prime minister. They also then shit on you, not literally. They are Indians, but
they would.
They would if they could. They also then, crap on you by saying, "Oh well, we've sent something to the moon. You haven't done that." And it's like, well, we have. It was called NASA. It was in America, but it was run by Anglos, right? Anglos and Germans.
Well, certainly Germans, von Braun, who made the V2 rocket. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you go and look at the names of a lot of people at NASA, you're going to see, a lot of Anglo names.
But Britain did have a space program in the 60s.
Yeah, it did.
We even sent up satellites and shit. But of course, nowadays, all that money goes on the National Health Service and importing millions of Indians. And giving India millions of aid. So,
Yeah, should be more like millions of AIDS, but yeah.
I cannot endorse that statement publicly on YouTube. You mean in Minecraft?
Yeah, in Minecraft,
but yeah.
In the craft mines, yeah.
Yeah. Again, look, we're wandering a bit from this, but yeah. So yeah, there's that. Let me see. There was another thing I wanted to talk about. Look, I'm perfectly willing to accept that Britain did lead the anti-slavery movement in the early and mid-19th century. Yes, we did. Was that a good thing from Britain's point of view today? I am by no means sure. But we did it. It was the spirit of the age, I guess. And there were huge numbers of Americans who were anti-slavery. It wasn't just the Brits. And indeed, the American Navy even got involved in anti-slavery stuff. So,
Yeah, even then, I'm kind of a bit dubious of the size of some of those movements, though. Like again, they were small, elitist, organized movements. They weren't really sort of, anti-slavery sentiment in Britain. I don't think people in Britain just really cared that much at that time.
Some of the liberal lefties did, yeah. The liberal lefties did.
That was such a tiny subset of the population, though.
The Conservatives much less, for sure. Yeah. And back then they actually were conservative. So, but yeah, no, I don't disagree with that, and I think that's probably true. But you can't deny that Britain in the 19th century was the leading light in ending anti-slavery. It was. I'm not going to argue with Semiogogue on that one. I mean, we got rid of it, I don't know, 35 years before the Americans did, and without a massive war.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with slavery, I'm still not sure entirely what to think. I've heard things either way. It's like, on one hand, there was an aspect to which it wasn't becoming very profitable, and I've heard people argue the opposite. But it's like I've looked at like the graphs on things like sugar production out of the Caribbean, and the price was getting high, and it didn't shrink until like after the abolition.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I think there is some economic arguments there. There was a convergence of interest, maybe you could argue, which didn't cause
very
it,
likely
but played into it.
I've always thought that. Yeah, I've always thought that was the case. Yeah,
and I don't think that was what. I don't think it was just that suddenly the businessmen and the lefties could cross the thing and shake hands, and everyone lived happily ever after. But it definitely seemed that there was an organized minority that also happened to come about at a time when economic interests converged, and they happened to be in the right place at the right time, and they could actually get what they wanted, which is ultimately what we need to do for our own things as well. But
if only we could,
yeah.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, also the other thing is that freed slaves in Britain, slaves who the Royal Navy freed, were not brought to Britain. Britain set up a special colony for them in West Africa called Sierra Leone, which is next door to the colony that the Americans set up called Liberia. But of course, the Americans never ran their colony. And as AA has pointed out in a couple of good streams, Liberia has always been a total fuck up. Like the first thing the freed American slaves who went to Liberia did was to enslave the local blacks, but the Brits didn't do that. They ran Sierra Leone up until I think about the mid-60s, and in fact, British troops were there in 2001, stopping a nasty civil war which had spilled over from Liberia, surprisingly enough. But yeah, Britain didn't bring any of these freed slaves to the UK. They sold them in West Africa. Back in Africa where they came from.
Well, this is kind of because this comes up as well if you look at like King Leopold and the Free State of Congo.
Yeah.
like one of the things that
the slags off for that dude and the Belgians are much exaggerated, but yeah, all right.
Well, this is actually the thing, isn't it? Because like, funny enough, they a lot of the people nowadays who try to bring that up will say, look, here's these documents of these people at the time saying that it was run terribly, and it's like if you actually go and read what like the British force out there was reporting on it. What they were saying was like, you allowed these blacks to run around with European weapons. What the fuck are you thinking? Like, you know, they understood how these places needed to be run. They were under they were based and they were racist and they were.
The Belgians didn't have enough European NCOs and officers to actually like control their native forces.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like, even if you take, like, if you go to like the liberalism argument, that liberalism was like founded in Britain, like, yeah, to an extent, yeah, that's true, like kind of, and it's a bit cringe, but like, even if you look at those liberalists and you take them in their words, you know, the John Locke's and that type, they're not arguing for liberalism as it exists now. And what they're calling for doesn't really lead to what liberalism is now either. It's not something upstream of it. So yeah, the liberalism that we kind of look to now that gets blamed on the likes of John Locke is more of the Rousseauian sort of French variety.
Well, look, I mean, I remember Semiogogue specifically mentioned Palmerston, for example. And Palmerston wasn't a liberal, he was a Whig, which is like an older form of liberal. But by modern standards, Palmerston would be regarded as a Nazi today, for sure. Because Palmerston, in most respects, was, I wouldn't say he was to the right of me, but he was probably about level.
Well, I mean, bearing in mind the Whigs were like the shit libs of their day.
Yeah, but not compared to today at all. No. I mean, you know, it's like just not. Like Palmerston, if you just said to him, "Oh yeah, we want to turn 5-year-old little boys into pretend little girls," would have like had an epilepsy, you know.
But at least with the Whigs, you can actually kind of trace the lineage of the ideas, like maybe not the ideas themselves, but like the historiography that because I mean those Whigs believed in linear history, which yeah, it was a bit different, wasn't it? Like the Whig view of history has some nuances, doesn't it? But
I mean, like Palmerston was the gunboat diplomacy guy. He was the guy who actually coined the phrase gunboat diplomacy. Yeah, like, you know, if someone messed up around the British Empire or just outside the British Empire by doing anything to a British flagship or whatever, Palmerston's thing was, well, send a gunboat. And fuck them up. Not exactly the way like liberal lefty twats behave today at all. But on the other hand, he was also a guy who didn't want to get involved when Prussia and Austria invaded Schleswig-Holstein in Denmark in the late 1860s. Palmerston had said, "No, Britain's not getting involved in that bloody silly war. It's got nothing to do with us." Because why did Britain care who ran Schleswig-Holstein? I mean, the Danes did, but the Brits didn't.
Yeah.
So, you know, these guys were not the same as modern lefty liberals or modern neocons at all.
But you know, as I was saying, at least with the Whigs, you can kind of trace how they got from where they were then to where lefties are now. Like, there's a bit of a change of course. Funny enough, I think the biggest change of course was between the 50s and the 60s. So not even that long ago, really, in the grand sense of things. But I would argue, of course, this is where like America took over Europe proper as an empire.
You've also got when the right wing liberals left the Liberal Party in Britain in the 1890s, led by Joseph Chamberlain. I think that's another important point. The so-called liberal imperialists who supported the empire, etc., like Joseph Chamberlain, they left the Liberal Party and joined the Conservatives. I think that was quite important too, because like had Palmerston still been alive then, I think he probably would have been a liberal imperialist.
Yeah.
And these were also the guys, by the way, who were pushing for tariff reform, you know, to give protection to British and Empire and white Commonwealth industries. And they were also the guys who were pushing for an alliance with Germany.
Yeah.
Under the Kaiser. all of which I think would have been more sensible than what Britain actually did. And at the same time as those guys did that, Winston Churchill, who was never really a conservative, left the Conservatives and joined the Liberals.
Yeah. Did you have any other points on the stream to cover?
Oh yeah, a couple.
Yeah.
A couple. I mean, I'm quite happy for you to bring your points up too.
I'm kind of gone through mine. The only thing I was probably going to do is, which we can just do at the end, is reiterate what we agree with them on.
Okay, fair enough. All right, I just wanted to briefly talk about the Honourable East India Company.
Mm.
The Honourable East India Company was founded as a joint stock company in 1600. All right, so before the English Civil War, before Cromwell and all that stuff. But the company was not a big deal until about 1757, when Clive won his great victory at Plassey.
Mm.
So you're talking like almost 160 years after it was founded. But from the late 18th century onwards, the British government basically took over more and more control of what used to be called John Company. You know, the Honourable East India Company was called John Company. But the government controlled more and more of it. So, for example, the Governor-General of India was selected by the British government, and the governors of the three presidencies that India was divided into, like Madras, Bombay, and Bengal, they were all selected by the British government. The British government sent British Army soldiers to India, who would fight alongside Honourable East India Company soldiers, who were mostly Indian sepoys with a few British NCOs and all British officers.
Yeah.
Although eventually the Honourable East India Company also ended up with like 3 white regiments which were recruited in England, and they were paid better than British Army soldiers, and they also couldn't be flogged, which resulted, when they were folded into the British Army after the Indian Mutiny, resulted in something called the White Mutiny, which wasn't really a mutiny, it was more of a strike, because they didn't want to join the British Army, where they were paid less and could be flogged in 1858. But the Honourable East India Company was, from 1833, it was no longer a trading company at all. It didn't do any trade.
How long was it a trading company for? Do we know?
Well, from 1600 until 1833, it did some trade.
Right.
But as I said, increasingly from about, 1775, shall we say? So about the time of the American War of Independence. From about that time, the British government actually really controlled the Honourable East India Company. It wasn't like some sort of independent company. It was basically run by the British government. But from 1833, it couldn't trade at all. It was not a trading company. And then you had the Indian Mutiny in 1857 and 1858, which basically resulted in the company being wound up. The only thing it continued to do was it still ran the tea trade until the 1870s, and then even that was like wound up. So I think you're reaching a bit to try and say that the Honourable East India Company was some sort of proto-globalist organization. I just don't think it's true. It wasn't. It didn't have the opportunity to be that, even had it wanted to be. I am perfectly willing to say that the British did. They stamped out the thuggy guys in India, who for hundreds of years had murdered travellers on Indian roads, partly for profit, well, actually probably largely for profit, but also to support the Indian goddess Kali. And we also banned sati, which was Hindu widows being burned alive on their husband's funeral pyre. And I am perfectly willing to admit there were a tiny, tiny number of very devout Hindu women who knelt on their husband's funeral pyre and got burnt to death. But actually, the vast majority of them were chucked on when the fire was going, screaming. And the Brits stopped that. And I'm sorry, I don't think that was a bad thing.
I'm sure they cover something like this in Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days, I'm sure.
Yeah, maybe so, but like the Brits did stop those things.
Well, the Sooty thing is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because like, okay, is that us meddling in their cultures and traditions? Well, yeah, a little bit, but at the same
Also
time,
being
like,
civilized.
yeah, but at the same time, like, they were actually like upper class, Indian sort of philosophers and that at the time, calling for us to help them.
Yeah, who didn't like it? Yeah, there were a few. Yeah. Not all that many, but there were.
No. But it was very much a case that it was something we didn't like anyway. And then there was also this small elitist band within Indian society that wanted it gone too. Again, there's a small convergence there, but I'm not trying to claim emergent behavior or anything here.
I read a lot of history, and as you know, and like I've read accounts of British soldiers in India in the early 19th century when Sati hadn't been broken out. And I'm talking about people who were sergeants and stuff, not like lieutenant colonels or anything like that. And they were just aghast that this sort of bullshit could happen, because bear in mind, all of a rich Hindu guys, all of his concubines would also be chucked on his pyre, and like some of those were like little girls of 18 and 19. And you can read accounts of hard-bitten British infantry sergeants in the 1820s saying, "What the fuck, man?
Yeah.
How is this happening? We run this place, So I kind of get why they stopped it, and I'm not going to say it was bad. I'm sorry, I'm just not. I'm not in favour of chucking.
To be fair, as
anyone alive on funeral pyres.
We did still allow them to practice it for quite a while and not tread on their toes. Like, I think, if I'm remembering right, didn't we ban it within certain regions, but we allowed some of the northern regions to continue it for a short while. We gradually
spread it.
Yeah,
it was banned in all, because what people don't often realize about India is that there were lots of semi-independent states in India. The British had a resident in, but there was no British forces there, and basically all their internal stuff they could do as they liked, but all the actual British run areas, it was pretty much banned by the 1840s at latest.
Yeah.
And it gradually, by the end of the 19th century, it was banned everywhere, basically.
Yeah, I'm sure. I suppose, like, you're probably thinking, like, where do you draw the line between what is, is teaching people not to eat off the floor or not to burn their widows or whatever? Is that the same as cultural imperialism done for America today? I mean, and this is also throwing a bone to the Spanish. Maybe you just say, like, the point at which we say, no, we're not accepting human sacrifice in what we rule. That's kind of the accepted line.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I would also point out it wasn't only the British who had an East India Company. The Dutch did, the French did, the Portuguese did, the Spanish did. So, and if you're really going to talk about interfering with people, I mean, the American fleet that went to China, went to Japan. The Brits didn't do that. I mean, we fought wars against the Japanese afterwards and then became best allies with the Japanese between 1902 and 1922. But it wasn't a Royal Navy fleet that forced the Japanese to open up to the world. It was an American one.
Do you think the British would have anyway, eventually, given enough time?
No, I don't. The Britain ended up fighting a war against one of the Japanese shogun types, because all Britain did was, once America did that, Britain turned around and said, okay, well, we'll get the same concessions for our dudes. But it wasn't the British that did it.
Yeah.
And as I say, eventually the Brits and Japanese became best allies between 1902 and 1922. Another reason I don't like the Washington Naval Conference is the Americans insisted the Brits dropped the Anglo-Japanese alliance, and the Japanese were mortally upset by that, and I don't blame them.
Mm.
Because, of course, the British and Japanese fleets between them would have heavily outnumbered the Americans. That's why they did that. But the Americans didn't give Britain any sort of alliance in return, as America never does with any of that. The whole special relationship thing is, it's great when Britain sends forces to go and help the Americans, but the Americans never help the Brits. Almost never.
Mm. Yeah, I remember reading that even quite late in the game, like right up until the point of the Washington Naval Treaty, the Japanese were spending like a third of all their tax revenue on their navy.
Ships. Yep.
Yeah. Which is colossal. That was actually also what the Royal Navy did, though, in the early 1800s.
Well, it wasn't anywhere near as much as the Japanese, because Britain was a much richer and bigger economy than Japan was, even in 1922. But
it was a third of domestic tax revenue, which was only import tariffs at the time.
Oh yeah,
so that amount was smaller, but yeah, it was a third of that.
But there was like income tax in UK was very, very low in those days compared to now, anyway. And of course, we weren't supporting that giant millstone around Britain's neck called the National Health Service.
But, and the pensions.
And pensions, but I mean, if you want to go and see the last British pre-dreadnought battleship, you got to go to Japan and look at the Mikasa, which was the Japanese flagship at Tsushima when they fucked up the Russians. And that ship was built in Britain, and it's a museum ship to this day. And it was actually a variation of a British battleship of the time.
We sell it to them.
Yeah. Most of the Japanese ships were built by the British.
I want to go and see it now.
Yeah, the Mikasa's great. She's wonderful, and she survived World War II by a miracle. She's the last British-built battleship, pre-dreadnought battleship that you can see anywhere in the world.
Wow.
In fact, I think she's the last actual British battleship you can go and see anywhere in the world, unless you count HMS Warrior in Portsmouth, which was like a much older ship from 1860.
Yeah.
But I mean, look, as I said, none of that. One final point, and I thought this was really quite important from the Semiogogue stream. Let me see. I've written all this shit down, by the way, guys. Right. Women in Britain did not get the vote until after World War I ended in 1918. And even when they did get the vote, the only women who got the vote were married women who were either householders or, much more often, married to householders of at least 30 years of age. So in Britain, even after World War I, the only women who could vote either had to own a house, in most cases back then they would have been a widow, probably from World War I, and they had to be 30 years old. No other women in Britain were allowed to vote. And it was only in 1928, under a Labour government, by the way, that British women over 21 got the vote. Now, to contrast that, in America, in some American states and territories, women were given the vote as early as the 1830s. So, Semiogogue cannot sit there, much as I like Semiogogue, and I do like him, but he is wrong to sit there and turn around and say, oh yeah, British Empire was spreading women getting the vote. No, it wasn't. America was doing that, not Britain at all. No British women got the vote at all until after World War I. And even when they did, they had to be 30 and also a householder or married to a householder.
It's kind of funny, isn't it? Because it's like, we've been in Afghanistan twice, right? We went there during the Great Game.
We've been in Afghanistan 4 times, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But considering twice over two periods, essentially. We've been in there in the modern period as a colony of America, and we were there, back in the day. Thinking of like Mrs.
78 to 80. 1919 was the third Afghan war for the British.
Yeah.
78-80 was the second Afghan war for the British, and 1838-42 was the first Afghan war for the British. So yeah.
Which one was Mrs. Butler's painting from?
Which painting?
The Man on the Horse. What's it called? Graveyard of
Empire?
Oh,
that's the first one. 1838-42. Yeah.
But let's take
Dr. Bryden, I believe his name was, the only survivor.
Let's take the last one though. 1919. If you take
that was a weird one, because the Afghans fought and were told by their early men that all of the British soldiers had been killed in World War I, and they swiftly found out that wasn't true.
Well, okay, then let's take the second one then. The second war.
78-80.
Yeah.
That's the one Kipling writes about.
Yes. And is that also? No, I'm thinking of something else. So you've got let's say Gordon Brown in when was it, like 2009, saying, "Oh, we won't. British soldiers won't fight in Afghanistan, where women aren't allowed to go to school, right?" Or where women don't get the vote. And it's like, he doesn't comment on, however, on Bakabazi, though.
No.
Oddly enough.
British soldiers will absolutely fight supporting warlords who have little 13-year-old boys who they fuck up the arse. Yeah, absolutely. Great, Gordon. and British and American soldiers both complained about that to their superiors and were told to get stuffed.
Yeah. And it's like, and that's at a time when Britain is in the modern era, right? Is a colony of America. Were any, even in the third Afghan war, would it be conceivable for a British officer or even a British politician to say, we won't fight in Afghanistan or we'll fight the Afghanistani government because this, that, and the other, because women don't get the vote, because women can't go to school.
Of course not. And you must have seen, as I have, and like the wanker lefty documentaries that used to be on YouTube. I don't know if they still are, of like some fat British feminist trying to tell Afghan women how feminism is the only way to go. Shortly before we all ran away. Yeah.
I mean, the funny thing is the American lefty media now tries to shame Britain for being sexist and transphobic. Which of course is funny because they usually try to play this narrative off where they're constantly trying to shame red state Americans for being backwards compared to Europeans, and now they're kind of shifting it the other way, and now they're actually starting to say that Europeans are sexist and racist.
If only we were. I mean, I am. Well, but, I mean, if only we were. Generally.
Yeah, if only we were more. Yeah. Turf Island. Yeah, that's, as Michael K has said in the chat. Yeah, Turf Island. That's what they call it. If only.
It's just crazy.
Of course, TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists, and they won't find a feminist.
And they ain't our friends. Trust me, they're not.
No. But yeah, someone earlier said that feminism is kind of an American aberration, and that does kind of seem to be true. I'm not sure if I'd say entirely, but there's a lot of.
Always remember, Ataman, that the first feminists, the suffragettes, who were actual terrorists who planted bombs and tried to kill people and all that, that they were the same women who went around in 1914 and 1915 giving any young British bloke who was in civilian clothes white feathers, because they weren't in the First World War. They were the same women, the same mostly middle class women, it has to be said. I knew, because I'm an old bastard, when I was a young bloke, like teenager, I knew loads of World War I veterans, because I used to work for this preservation society that did fishing in the Surrey docks and stuff. and I was supposed to go around and sell them day tickets for like 50 pence each, you know. Mostly I didn't bother. I just used to say I didn't worry about it because they were nice old blokes. But I would sit there listening to their World War I stories and all the rest of it because I'm into military history. And like, you know, these guys would tell you about being in the trenches and doing over-the-top bayonet attacks and all this kind of stuff. And I was this one dude who I got to know quite well and was living in a, I don't know, 19th story flat in some vile high-rise thing as his reward for being a hero. He told me that his wife was terrified that he was going to die because, like, every day in the British newspapers there were these long lists of killed and wounded in France. And so when he went home he got wounded on the Somme. And he went to hospital and they made him better. And then in 1917, he had to go back and join his regiment in France because he was better. But because he was going to see his wife and she was terrified of him getting killed, he made sure he was wearing civvies and not his uniform. And so on like the bus in Bermondsey in inner South London to go and see his missus, I can't remember, it was a bus or a train. Some middle-class bitch gave him a white feather because he was wearing a civilian clothes. And like he was in his late 20s. He spat in her face.
Yeah.
And Mike perfectly understood why he did that.
Yeah, my great-grandfather, he was very, very badly wounded in World War II. And completely deafened as well. And he kept getting given white feathers when he was like walking around back home. And my nan Peg, what we called her, my great grandmother, his wife, used to be absolutely incensed at it. He used to go out and have a go at them if she found out.
Good. But I mean, like this guy, like I say, he was wounded in the Battle of the Somme and was just about to go back with his regiment. And this silly bitch gives him a white feather. Jeez. And all he was trying to do was not scare his wife by wearing his uniform on his embarkation leave.
Yeah.
It's just absolute insanity. This is what happens all the time. You know, you look at all these cheeky chicks in Ukraine who are partying away while the Ukrainian dudes are all getting killed on the front. You know, it's like, yeah, that's the way it works. Funny how feminism doesn't come into play in these situations, do you think?
Yeah, it's not a natural state, is it? It's
no, it's just bullshit. It's just bullshit. I mean, look, women make crap soldiers, but look, don't pretend they don't. You know, but yeah, I don't know. I think. Let me just double check where my notes here, but I think that was like most of the things I wanted to bring up. So I think that was probably most of it. I mean, the final point I'd make is that Britain did not tend to do what America often does, and in fact has consistently done since World War II, and even before World War II. Britain didn't tend to occupy somewhere in the world and then leave. And when she did, and there was only a couple of occasions when she did. One was in Afghanistan, when after the war that ended in 42, Britain left, but then Britain had to go back in 1878 and then left again. And then, of course, we got the third Afghan war in 1919 because we'd left. And then the most serious case for Britain was probably in South Africa, when we withdrew after the First Boer War, which was 1880-81, which then led to the very much more serious Second World War, 1899-1902. Had we not withdrawn, wouldn't have happened.
But of course, the funny thing is,
not only for the Brits but also for the Afrikaners.
I mean, to the argument of taking over places and then leaving. I mean, Afghanistan was a pig, right? It was an absolute pig to hold, and it didn't really have much. I mean, it has resources that we recognise now, like lithium and
I don't think we should have gone in there at all,
Ataman,
but the point is, if you do go in there, leaving... I mean, America did this with Vietnam, of course. They did it in Iraq. They did it in Afghanistan. They've done it in many places. To some degree, they even did it in the Philippines.
Yeah.
But this is not a good plan. It never is. But Britain, as an empire, did not tend to do that. It was an exceptional case when Britain did that.
Yeah.
Which is the only point I'm trying to make. Britain. I don't think you can really argue that Britain was the start of the GAE. I really don't. Certainly not generally speaking, rather than a few particular cases.
Yeah.
The other thing I would also like to point out is the thumbnail for this stream, which you will see is the British John Bull, and then the American Uncle Sam carrying loads of assorted people on a basket up a mountain towards the top, which is labeled civilization. That's called the white man's burden. And the reason I picked that thumbnail is it's not a British thumbnail. That's an American thumbnail from a popular American magazine called Puck from the late 19th century. So that's an American thumbnail, not a British one.
Although anyone who may be aware of friends of the channel, and particularly Chris Gard, he has done a musical ballad of Kipling's White Man's Burden.
Oh yeah, I play that all the time. Ataman, excuse me for a minute. I got to answer.
Yeah. Oh shit! I don't think he meant to leave. Oh well. I mean, particularly if you go and look at the Kipling poem of White Man's Burden, it's kind of it's not quite what you often hear lefties bringing up White Man's Burden. It's not quite how the poem or the connotations of the term are used. Yeah, that's Duke's intro music. Yes, it is. I've taken over. It's my stream now, but I've kind of run out of points to cover about this debate, this stream that they did. It is worth to go and check out and listen to Semiogogue and Pete in their own words. I've tried tonight to not be particularly cruel or misconstrue them in any way because I don't want to. But yeah. What's that? Loafer Sheffield. Bugger a man in a sharp suit. You need a blunt bloke in a blue collar shirt. Chris Gard.
Sorry with that, guys. Yeah, Chris Gard's musical version of Kipling's The White Man's Burden is brilliant, and I play it for all of our Splendid Isolation streams. But of course, that was addressed by Kipling to the Americans after the Spanish-American War, when America ended up taking over the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba for a while.
Yeah, and it's funny enough that phrase gets used a lot nowadays, but it's not like Kipling is. Kipling is kind of criticizing the term, or he's kind of criticizing the implications behind it, I suppose.
Yeah, he's pointing out that it's a hard road to walk. For sure. Yeah, absolutely right. But yeah, look, I don't know. I hope you covered most of the points you wanted to talk about. I think I've covered most of the ones I did.
Yeah.
I think the British Empire was a damn sight more based than whatever is going on in America these days. But I would absolutely separate the American people and the British people from their governments. They're not the same, and today they're even less the same than they ever were before.
Yeah.
Like, does senile Biden or Indian bagger Sunak really represent any Americans or any British people, like original Americans or the Aboriginal people of Britain? I.e. the Anglo-Celts, because if the Maoris in New Zealand are Aboriginal, then the Brits certainly are, because the Brits have been in England and Britain a lot longer than the Maoris have been in New Zealand. But,
Well, I mean, this is the other thing as well, though, is that not to do the oh, look what they took from us, but to an extent, the American empire was probably not originally destined to be what it's become now. You can go and look at some of the great public buildings of the old American cities, some of which are still standing now, and you can kind of glimpse at an American empire that was going to be significantly more based and has kind of been taken away from what it could have been.
For sure. Yeah, I totally agree with
that. And, in the same way that we kind of sit here and get upset about what's been taken from us by America, but also by our own elites, the American people themselves have also been massively betrayed in all of this. So.
Oh, yeah, look, I think Semiogogue got this completely right. Britain was raped by these elites, and America's now being, like ordinary American people are now being raped by these same elites. It's just, it happened to Britain first.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and as I said, this is in no way meant to be a criticism of Semiogogue. I like Semiogogue. He's got one of the most intelligent right of center channels on YouTube. And I really like him. I've watched all of his streams.
Yeah.
And I very often listen to Pete Quinones also. I don't always agree with Pete Quinones' guests, but most of them I do for sure.
Yeah. But yeah, other than that, I've got nothing else to add. I think we've covered the subject actually pretty well.
Cool. Then I'm happy. Like I said, if you want to see Semiogogue stream, you'll find the link in the description. What that link does is link you to a YouTube channel, a YouTube video, which will then link you to the actual stream itself, because Pete Quinones is sensibly enough doesn't do much on YouTube now because YouTube's so full of censorship, sadly. I would like to play us out with what I think is one of the best things AA has done ever. And I like AA. I don't always agree with him, certainly not about Tony Blair, for example. But I like AA generally, and many of his guests. And this was great. I just like what he did with this, and it's just so true. So I'm going to play us out with that. Hopefully, anyway. Oh, there you go.
All the stories have been told of kings in days of old, but there's no England now. All the wars that were won and lost somehow don't seem to matter very much anymore. All the lies we were told, all the lives of the people running round, their castles are burned. I see change, but inside we're the same as we ever were. Living on a thin line. Ooh, tell me now, what are we supposed to do? Living on a thin line. Ooh, tell me now, what are we supposed to do? Living on a thin line, living this way, each day's a dream. What am I, what are we supposed to do? Walking on a thin line.
Don't know what happened to Duke. Oh, you're back. Oh, all right.
Sorry, mate. I don't know what happened there. I get a strange thing happening to my internet sometimes. Yeah, I thought that was one of the best things AA has done. On the other hand, I don't think the British people are finished yet.
Well, I mean, I'll be honest. I have some doubts about cyclical history. This is quite the time to drop that bombshell. But
Yeah, I don't know, mate. I don't think the British people are finished yet. I have quite a lot of faith in them.
I don't think people lose spirit generally. I think elites do. I think if you could.
Oh yeah. If it's down to our elites, we're totally fine. I mean, when I say our elites, they're not even our elites for the most part. I mean, Sunak, etc. But things could change. And I remember you saying to me only a few weeks ago on a Splendid Isolation stream that things could change fairly quickly.
Yeah, it's hard to see what it would look like, but it's kind of like when you read historical accounts of stuff getting rectified, whether it's Caesar or other various figures and stuff that's happened. It's that phrase when they say there are decades when months happen and months where decades happen, or some such iteration of it. That's very true. The momentum can pick up so quick in a way that you don't even really, I think even people at the time don't even fully appreciate.
Hopefully. I really hope that's the case, because
I mean, I went to the event, didn't I? The Witten.
Yeah.
And I went to the one last year as well. And it's like AA actually said today on Twitter, he said like people mocked him for the network of tens, but after the recent event, he can see it starting to come together. And I agree with that. There's so much energy in these things, and they're full of smart, competent people. I was speaking to all sorts of guys, some of which it was their first event. And a lot of them were quite young, and some of them were, they were PhD candidates at, Oxford, or they were, and you saw there the making of a new elite. it's just 120 guys in a room. It's barely a beginning, but it's more than what we had, let's say, 10 years ago.
I am very keen for, as you know, I live in Australia.
Yeah.
Although I'm an Englishman who was born in London, I am very keen for Australia to have an event.
Yeah.
And I know Lady of Shalott also wants to do that. And several other pretty well-known Australian people like Chris Card, etc. Australia needs to have an event. I think they're a very good idea. And they're a big help in transferring this internet stuff into real life.
Yeah. I mean, I've been looking for an excuse to come to Australia for a while. So if there's an Australian event, I'll come down.
Well, I look, if we have one, it should be in Melbourne, I think. And I will certainly go. And if I can, I'll speak it for sure. Absolutely. We do need one in Australia for sure. And hopefully, if any of AA's collaborators are listening to this, they will take note of that. Because Australia is definitely the next place that needs one for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, did the audio for that tune actually play out?
Only for the first half, I think.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to put it up again because I've got rid of it now. I'll play it on the. I'll play it on our Splendid Isolation stream on Saturday night, Sunday morning. So
yeah,
I'll do it then. But it's a good tune, and I think well done, AA. I see people in the chat coming out with snarky comments and all the rest of it. I'm just going to ignore it, to be honest. I went out with a Persian girl many, many moons ago now, and she was at least as white as me. Very pretty too. So I'm not going to get involved in that shit. I'm not as how can I put it? I'm not as worried about minutiae as some people seem to be. You know, and AA is generally pro-British, I would say, and so long as he's generally pro-British, then I will support him.
The funny thing is, I criticised him saying that in the past he's been a little anti-English.
Yeah,
that seems to come more from his Welsh half.
Yeah, I was going to say that might be Welsh.
It does, when you listen to it, it does echo of Welshness rather than
absolutely. I think that's actually much more likely, to be honest with you. And fair enough. I kind of like the local rivalry between the English and Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish and what have you. I think that's entirely healthy, you know.
He does write a Substack on Is He White, which is quite an interesting read.
Well, like I said, I've been out with a Persian girl who was as white as I was, and so I don't have a great deal of issues about that, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And like I said, so long as he's pro-British, fine. That's what I really care about. Lavish is saying Persians are nowhere near as white as you believe me. Well, maybe so, Lavish. The ones I've known were. But on the other hand, she was a Persian girl who left when the Shah was chucked out, which I think is pretty much what happened with AA's dad. And they tended to be the more elite Persians, shall we say, which I think might have something to do with it as well. But certainly, if you read the ancient Greeks, even, they don't talk about the Persians being particularly brown. So anyway, there you go. That's a side topic. Thank you very much to my guest, Ataman. Ataman, anything you wanted to plug, mate?
No, I might be uploading a video or making a video for my actual YouTube channel, the Ataman one.
That would be cool.
Yeah, well, I kind of want to.
If you do, put it in the Discord, mate, and I'll make sure we publicize it.
Yeah.
But that would be good. We will be back. Well, I will be back anyway. I hope Alman will be, but I will be back for sure. Saturday evening, Sunday morning this weekend for the next Splendid Isolation stream, which we do every week, which will look at news and current events from a right of center and traditionalist reactionary type of angle. Don't be put off by the Royal Navy warship thumbnails. That's partly to fool YouTube and partly because I actually do like Royal Navy history. So anyway, Eddie goes in with splendid isolation, which was the period in the late 19th century when Britain had no allies, but the biggest navy in the world and didn't need any. So there we go. All right, guys. Thanks to the chat for joining us. I don't think we got any super chats, but I will have a little chat. No, we didn't. So there we go. Thanks very much, guys. Go well, and we'll see you for the next stream.
Yeah, see you later.
Can't that?